when bank stocks did a little bit better and the stock market did better. That has flattened out. That's not continuing. One of the reasons people talk about a so-called double dip, that is, we had the collapse in 2008 until around March of 2009, then a recovery of the banks and the stock market for about a year, and now that's flattening out, and the fear is it's going to go down again. A second or double dip in 2010-11, similar to the one that really went down in 2008. The fear of that. And by the way, it's not just an economic fear, it's a cultural and psychological fear. It's one thing to have a collapse explode on the American people, unprepared as they were. It's another thing to have them go through a horrible time, tell them that there's a recovery, and then have the hope of that dashed. That's very dangerous politically. Not dealing with this crisis has already proven itself to be dangerous. Mr. Obama came in on a wave of excitement against the Bush administration, in which the Bush administration was blamed heavily for the economic crisis that was crashing all around us in 2008. Mr. Obama in November of 2008 was the candidate everybody looked to offset what Bush had done. Mr. Obama, like Mr. Bush, had every economic advice imaginable, every incentive to have that advice serve well, to do the things that would make you politically popular. Mr. Bush's advisors could not save him or the Republicans from being blown out of the water in 2008. Mr. Obama, with his advisors, including quite a few carried over from the earlier regime, had every incentive again to do everything possible to make this crisis at least seriously look like it was being overcome, or else risk that the crisis that blew Mr. Bush away would become the crisis that blows Mr. Obama away. With all his advisors and all his incentive, he couldn't do it. The power of this crisis is much larger and runs much deeper than anything these political leaders can do. And the truth of it is, they know it. They know it. I know many of the advisors of Mr. Obama, and they know very well, and they're very frightened about what's going on. They do all these things, and then they cross their fingers right behind their backs and hope like hell it works. And what the election showed them is, in the first 2 years, they bombed. It didn't. And they don't know at all what they're facing now. And part of what you see with the Federal Reserve is an action desperate, as you'll see in a minute, to try to keep this situation from spinning out of control. Okay. Last thing by way of introduction. The elections, since a number of you asked me to say something about them. A couple of things. 40% of the eligible voters in this country voted. In other words, 60% didn't. I think that's a very crucial number you should never forget. 60% of the American people didn't vote. Since many of the elections were quite close, then basically it's 20% on one side and 20% on the other that decided most elections. Give or take 20 on one, give or take 20 on the other. Number two, the election is a spectacle in this country of something which I would also urge you to think about, which has always struck me since I'm an economist, the following. If the two biggest dimensions of this economic crisis are unemployment and home foreclosures, the dramatic experience of millions of our fellow citizens losing their jobs and millions of our fellow citizens losing their homes, let's remember who produces unemployment and who forecloses homes. First, unemployment. Unemployment was 7 million in December 2007, the official beginning of the current year. It's now 15.5. So we got an extra 8+ million people lost their job over the 3 years of this economic crisis. Out of the 8 million, 500,000, roughly, maybe 600,000, were people who were fired from a government job, a federal government job, a state government job, a local. You know, a local teacher, a prison guard at a state prison, a road worker who takes tolls, a inspector of something for a government office. The other 7.5 million people who became unemployed were fired by a private capitalist employer. That's how they became unemployed. No politician did that. No political leader did that. Private capitalist employers produced the overwhelming bulk of the unemployment that we focus on as a key sign of this crisis. Let's turn then to foreclosure. Who forecloses? Private bank corporations, private hedge fund operators, private investment banks. The people who get thrown out of their houses get thrown out because a private enterprise goes to court to proceed against them and have the sheriff chuck their stuff on the street. Not politicians. The genius of American capitalism, it's much better at this than in other countries, has been to cultivate in our population a knee-jerk reaction. If the economy is in terrible shape, get angry at the politician. If I were a businessman in the United States, I would be smiling with joy at this situation. I kick you, and you're angry at somebody over there. I kick you again, and you get even angrier at that person over there. Private capitalists unemploy us, evict us, and we get angry at politicians, furious at them, furious at the government. The government is doing it to us. No, it isn't. But we believe that. And so we throw out the rascals from office and bring in the next crew. And if we're not happy 2 years later, we chuck them out again and bring in the same crew we threw out 2 years ago. And instead of saying, isn't that silly, isn't that irrational? It isn't silly and it isn't irrational. It comes out of a culture that has trained the American people to see the problem in the state, in the political realm, thereby kind of preventing the rage and anger to be directed where you might otherwise expect it would go first, which is to the people who fired you, to the people who evicted you. And those are not politicians. And I think this election is a sign that that process is alive and well. And it is certainly stoked heavily by the Tea Party folks, since they are in a white rage of hostility against the government. Some of you may remember the liberal commentators making fun last summer of the old people carrying signs, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare." And the reporters enjoyed saying to them, the government is Medicare. It already has its hands because it's a government program. But that was a mistake. What you should have done is you should have recognized the power of the ideology in the United States, that if you like something, it's not the government, Medicare. And if you don't like something, it is the government. That equation, which is the Tea Party rides on, but certainly didn't start, runs much deeper in this country, lies behind, in my own humble opinion, the spectacle of these elections that seem so weird if you're not clued in to this ideological structure of the United States. Okay, let me turn then to the particular issue that I want to talk about a little bit, and then we'll open it up, and that is the Federal Reserve's action. So first, let me make sure you understand what it is. The Federal Reserve is the entity in our economy that plays the role of what in other countries are called central banks. So for example, if you go to France, there's the Bank of France. Or if you go to Britain, there's the Bank of England. That's the bank that is the central governmental entity controlling the monetary system. And we used to have a Bank of the United States early in our history, but there was a lot of political struggle around that, so we got rid of it. And a little bit later, about 100 years ago, early in the 20th century, we created the Federal Reserve System. It is our central bank. We just don't call it the central bank. But other than that, it exactly does what the other central banks do. One of the things a central bank does is control the money supply. Literally produces the money. And the government has an absolute monopoly in that. You're aware of that. If you make some money yourself in your basement, people will come and hurt you and make you go to jail. You cannot do it. It is a government monopoly. I just want to remind you, because we are all creatures of the ideology here in the United States, that when you hear people saying, we don't need the government on our backs, the government should get out of the economy, they don't, of course, mean that. Or if you actually encounter someone who means it, then get a straitjacket quickly, because these people need help. We always have had the government in a kind of, actually not always, but in our modern history, the government has always had a monopoly on money. And therefore the government has an enormous influence on what happens, as you can imagine, anybody would who had a monopoly on the money. So the idea that the government need not, should not, cannot, does not play a major role in our economy is a product of fantasy. It has nothing to do with the way our economy works. The government has always been a crucial factor in the American economy, and the notion that we could have a private economy in which the government does not meddle is a fantasy. If you believe that, then I will sell you a small portion of the Brooklyn Bridge as soon as this meeting is over. It's silly. So the government controls the money supply. And the government has a simple way of thinking. If the economy is in trouble, if people are unemployed, if jobs are falling away, if businesses are bankrupt, if a third of the stores on 6th Avenue remain empty for long periods of time, then how do we get the economy going again? And there are basically not that many ways of doing it. And capitalism, being a very unstable system that has had these cycles all through its history, has come to figure out that there are two broad kinds of ways to boost an economy when it is down. One of those